From the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, HEC-TV, Boeing, and the Danforth Center are proud to present Conversations, a discussion about innovation in agriculture.
Well, welcome to the Conversations program. This is the first of the 2012. It feels like the summer of 2012 already. I'm Matt Wolf. I'm the chair of the Danforth Friends Committee. And a couple announcements to make. First, would like to thank the Boeing Company. They have been the sponsor of this for the last 4 years, so thank you for that. This evening's program is being recorded for broadcast on the Higher Education Channel. As part of the partnership with HEC-TV, this evening's program will be aired on Sunday, March 25th, 5 p.m., and if you have Charter, that is channel 989. These are listed up here. And AT&T Universe, that's channel 99. So, as you came in, hopefully you were handed one of these. Brief bios for our panelists. Dr. Brian Clevenger and Jan Jaworski are on the backs of this if you want to see their bios. Included on the other side is the question and answer portion, where you can send in your questions and use this card to hand to the people that will be in the aisle, and they will bring them up. We want to cut that off around 6:05, after which no written questions can be submitted. However, if time permits, the floor will be open for additional questions for the audience. Staff members will be in the aisle with microphones. Before we begin our formal program, on behalf of the Friends Committee and the Danforth Center, I'd like to acknowledge someone very special who's joining us today. He was also here earlier this week. In fact, he is such a regular here at the Danforth Center, I think he's going to be a little shocked for his recognition. Still, the leadership of the Friendship and the Friends Committee thought it was time to recognize his service. And so, for only the second time in our history, tonight we'd like to convey a special volunteer award to begin our program. This award is the The award is the Newell Jim Knight Volunteer Award, which is named after one of the most dedicated, enthusiastic volunteers here. When created, it was stated that a volunteer receiving it should share Jim Knight's dedication to the center. No small measure if you know Jim Knight, who's pictured in the middle. Tonight's honoree is often a partner in crime with Jim Knight, one of the center's first donors, a member of its Friends Committee. He's active on the Danforth Society Membership Committee, the Conversations Committee, and as a center docent and a frequent guest and presenter to groups throughout the St. Louis area to encourage them to support the Danforth Center. I don't know of any other committees that he can be on, but that's it. Our honoree never misses a conversation, invites potential donors to our Lunch with Leadership programs, assists with the planning of the Plantasia Gala. Each year without fail. He is now retired, though it is hard to believe that he's retired. He's so active. But in his career, he was with the EFCO Corporation, which is a national manufacturer of aluminum windows and storefronts for commercial and architectural applications. We're delighted when he was recognized recently as our city's ageless, remarkable St. Louisan. So, without further delay, it's my honor to present the Newell Jim Knight Volunteer Award to George Fania. George, come on. Say some words?
I must say I'm overwhelmed. I didn't know there was a Jim Knight Award, but anytime you're associated with Jim, you're doing something constructive because he's a hard taskmaster. at any rate, to thank you all very much. This is a wonderful organization, and we have just had a great meeting of the Friends, and I'll tell you, it's exciting what's going on here at the Plant Science Center and in our region. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. We have a plaque, which will be hung at the center, and then we have a clock.
It's not my picture, I want to tell you, it's Jim. I'll put that on my bureau.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, man.
Thank you. Speaking of a distinguished group, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Professor Jim Davis, and our distinguished panelists, Dr. Brian Clevenger and Dr. Jan Jaworski. Thank you.
Welcome. I'm delighted to see so many people here this evening for a conversation on plant science innovation or agricultural innovation. And I'm delighted to especially welcome our two guests this evening, Jan Jaworski, who is here at the Plant Science Center, a principal investigator, and Brian Clevenger, who's managing director of Prologue, a venture capital company. He's been in the venture capital business one way or another for probably 20 years, and to my delight, once upon a time, was on the faculty at Washington University. Jan was on the faculty at Miami University in Ohio before he came here. The invitation that came in the mail talked both about plant science innovation and agricultural innovation. And though I recognize this is a plant science center, I see those varieties of innovation as somewhat different. Plant science innovation largely speaks for itself, but agricultural innovation, to my understanding, is broader. Agricultural innovation could include the cotton gin, or the tractor, or the corn picker, machinery to enable one person to do more, as opposed to plant science, which may enable a given unit of land to produce more. So we'll probably talk mostly about plant science innovation, but agricultural innovation may also come up. To start the conversation, I guess I have a question that either one of you may tackle, and that is, in the last 10, 20 years, is there a plant science innovation really significant, maybe even exciting, that you have seen move from lab to application? The invitation said the dinner plate, but to application. Because it's got to go through several steps, presumably, from the idea of the principal investigator to now it's commercial, it's being used.
Right. Well, want me to start? So actually there are many examples, and it depends on, and to some extent, what lab we're talking about. If we're talking about industry, we can simply look across the street and think about the many things that have come out of Monsanto. I think the kinds of stories I like are the stories where it starts maybe at a university or a basic research project, and people recognize, not necessarily the scientists involved, although the one I'm thinking of, the scientists did understand what the impact is, but many times research that's done in a laboratory is recognized by somebody from industry who actually knows what the application would be. There are many, many people in universities that simply don't think in those terms. I think that's actually what distinguishes the Danforth Center from many places, because we tend to think in terms not only of the basic research you're doing, but the application.
So the lab scientist may develop a solution, but he doesn't understand the problem that it's a solution to?
He may not even understand there is a problem. That he's
That's a problem.
That's right. But you know, a project that started here in St. Louis that essentially saved an agricultural industry is the story of papaya. Papaya is grown principally in Hawaii. There was a really terrible virus that was infecting, I think it's called spot ring virus, in the early 90s, late 80s. And the solution turned out to be the research that was started by Roger Beachy when he was at Washington University. He was not the one that solved this particular problem, but was using the technology that he was initially doing. And he was studying viruses. So his initial early work,
presumably not focused on papaya.
no, I don't think it was. Well, actually, I was hoping I'd bump into Roger before tonight. I didn't have a chance to ask him that. But it is nonetheless a really good example. And that one actually was done, by the way, almost independent of the large ag companies that we think about. It went through basic biochemistry, through and genetics, through to USDA, actually, and one of the agricultural stations, which was involved with papaya. The research was actually done principally at Cornell University. But it moved there, and it's literally saved the industry. The industry was almost dead in Hawaii, and now it's thriving. It's fine. But all the papaya we have is started out from a project that really was very basic research. So there are certainly examples of that. I think if one thinks about all of biotechnology, a lot of that started with Fraley and Rogers and Horsch across the street. And just the learning how to deal with genetic engineering was really pretty basic stuff, but incredibly important in terms of technology in advancing agriculture.
Brian, do you have an example of going from the laboratory bench to application?
Well, it's my favorite example because Prolog actually made a fair amount of money off of it. And I'm going to embarrass Derek since he's sitting right here in the audience. And it actually plays off of something that just set up, and that is that if at a very high level, probably the biggest thing that's happened in the whole biotechnology arena is the ability to manipulate genes, whether it's sequence them, turn them off, turn them on, or whatever. And a beautiful application of being able to harness that is to identify genes that are in one species that you're trying to control and not in those species that you do not want to harm. And so Derek's company, Divergence, is the title, very good name for a company, by the way. Divergence is all about identifying targets for gene targets that you could turn those genes off, but at the same time not hurt a plant or a human or an animal. And it took a long time because it was a difficult problem, but it was a wonderful marriage between a former Monsanto business development guy and a WashU professor, Jim McCarter. Jim came out with the fundamental idea, teamed up with Derek. That team was a spectacular team that did a lot of things right, which is one of the themes you'll hear out of my voice today, or my mouth today, is that the process of taking something from the bench top all the way to the table or the commercialization is very, very difficult. It's full of pitfalls. And for a group of managers to be able to do that is almost as remarkable as the science itself. And Derek and Jim were able to take that company all the way to the point where this was trying to control something called a nematode, a small worm that affects plants, animals, and humans. And they were able to develop a series of products such that at the end of the day, Monsanto bought it. And it was a brilliant effort, and it's clearly
Derek,
my favorite story.
And Derek is back with Monsanto.
Yeah, well, bad pennies come back around.
Now, you said you introduced another question. You said that between the bench, between the lab, and commercial application, there are a lot of pitfalls.
Extraordinary number of pitfalls.
List some of those. What are some of the obstacles? Someone in the audience will tell us when it's time to quit.
That's right. Well, this whole process is what's true about plant science, and in fact, it's true with Prolog, by the way, is broadly life sciences.
Sure.
So we do drugs, devices, ag, and practically anything that lives and breathes. they all have in common the fact that it takes a lot of money to bring it from the very early stage all the way to the commercialization. And we're talking about millions and millions and millions of dollars. Goodness knows if it's a drug, you've probably seen in the newspapers that it's $100 million and it can be 10, 15, 20 years. It's an enormous amount of money. So how do you raise that kind of money? Well, first of all, there's really only a couple ways to do it. And typically, I suppose Jan's this way too, you start off by receiving grants from the NIH, USDA, whatever, and that brings a technology to a certain point. And that used to be called kind of the valley of death, because that next piece of money, which is maybe the first money that's got to come in to take that technology and do maybe a proof of concept or some work in plants in the greenhouse or in animals. That amount of money, sometimes we're talking about $1 million or $2 million or something like that. That's hard to find, although it's getting a little bit better in St. Louis. There's a number of sources these days for that kind of money. But the next step, that step can be $5, $10, $15, or $20 million. And where does that money going to come from? Unless you get a really rich uncle, it often comes from people like us, venture capital firms, who are in the business of putting together funds to bring in that large amount of money to hit the more important milestones, the commercial milestones.
When I think about plant science innovation, I think about feeding now 7 billion people, moving towards 9 billion people, and a lot of those people are in developing areas. As we talk about plant science innovation now, we're talking about plant science innovation in the United States with a richly developed economy where at least some people will find that $15 or $20 million. What about plant science innovation that will benefit people in Africa or in Asia or in Latin America? Or will plant science innovation primarily go on in developed economies for the benefit of people living in those economies?
Well, I think, again, there are great stories that have certainly come out of this center that would certainly say that there's the place that the research is going to primarily be carried out is here. Certainly, many of you are aware that we have cassava trials that are ongoing in Africa, which are doing extremely well. But that was a very, very complicated path. I'm not sure if it was more complicated than what Brian just described, but on a very different scale and in a very different way, it was also very complicated. So in this building, we have an international office. I don't know of any science center or research center like ours of this size that has an international office that's staffed by 7 or 8 people. And many of them are in Africa right now, looking at field trials and having meetings. And so it required, I think, a tremendous amount of insight early on to recognize that going to Africa was also complicated as it is to get a company going. Maybe the risks were lower from the standpoint of finances, but I think the Gates Foundation early on recognized that it wasn't enough to do the science. It wasn't enough to make a super cassava, but it had to get from our greenhouse to Africa, and it required not just a plane, it required a lot of paperwork. It required people in government approving of these things, and the governments didn't have a process for approving them.
But then it also takes people to plant it, and they're not used to planting that one.
Well, actually, I think in this case we've done it right, and that is that the plants that we're bringing to Africa are the plants that they do know how to plant. They do know how to grow them. I think the most successful stories are going to be not trying to have anyone for that. And this is, by the way, I think true of all agriculture. The improvements that you want require that you use the plants that the farmers are used to using. And so if you're in Africa, you need to use plants that Africans are used to. We actually are facing the same thing in the United States. We have become very interested in and actually strong proponents of a plant called camelina. And one of the issues that we will face is getting farmers to adopt that plant and plant it. They don't normally grow camelina, and so they have to be convinced there's a reason for them to do it. And to sort of emphasize how difficult this can be, the USDA this past fall was willing to subsidize the planting of camelina in the Northwest. And where it doesn't normally grow, and they're just trying to get it going. There were no takers. Farmers are independent businessmen.
And there's an opportunity cost. If they grow that, they're not growing something else whose
That's
market
right.
they understand.
That's exactly right. So farmers are the ones who ultimately make the final decision. And this is true no matter where you are. So you have to really anticipate those things. And so a lot of the work that we're doing with camelina is to make it a better plant so that farmers will want to plant it. And this is going to be true for anything that we do in this sector. So I think this is, again, where there's a lot of risks that are associated with starting with basic research, getting something into a field. Because besides all of the financial risks, there is the issues that are getting that research in the proper plant to do the proper thing. And of course, I think this is what Brian his company is going to be evaluating. Do you have a market out there? Do you have a possibility of success?
And if it's a new plant, you're not sure you have a market until you have a market.
Or that's true. But it's a matter of, in our case, I think, trying to make it sufficiently valuable that you'll have the market.
One of the things we're talking about here, it seems to me, is the diffusion of innovation. Can you think more generally about what are the obstacles to diffusion? One, we've highlighted the absence of a market. Another obstacle is tradition. Call that habit if you want to. Are there other obstacles to diffusion? So you have a good plant, you have a new development, but you don't have any takers.
And I think a lot of that has to do with the nature of scientists that are at the bench. And I mean, to me, there's no accident, there's no mystery as to why companies like Monsanto are successful. And that is, their scientists are in the business of producing things for agriculture. This is what they wake up and think about. They know the markets for corn and soybean. They understand this business. A scientist, in most cases, does not. And so knowing which direction to go is very difficult for a basic scientist to understand, to know that. They have to be in an environment where people think about these things.
And the basic scientist is not thinking about future applications.
I think in general, that is often the case.
When you shifted from university to here, did you have to put on a new kind of thinking cap, as it were?
Not, for me, not especially, but to a large extent, that's why I came here. It was quite apparent that this was going to be a very good home for me. But it turns out, because of the nature of my research, I'm probably more of an exception to the rule, in that we deal with oilseeds and oils, and it has been fairly clear for quite a number of years that this was going to be an area of applications within plant biology and applications to agriculture. So I've been dealing with companies for over 25 years now, in one way or another. And most of them have come to me because they would think of the applications, but it didn't take long for me to realize, I think I should be thinking about this. So I had an early indoctrination, but that's not the normal path for most bench scientists. And certainly looking for somebody like Brian is never on the horizon.
Do you have to go out and hunt them up since they're not hunting for you?
Actually, they are hunting for us.
Okay. I can imagine. Venture capital, I understand what that means, yeah.
So of course, we of course get out into the community and make ourselves well known. But frankly, we're in an era right now where the amount of venture capital out there in the world is as small as it's been in a decade or so. And so it's a great time to VC because too many deals are chasing too few dollars. And so I can't think of a time, at least since I've been in the business, that the deal flow has been so rich. So it's been both qualitative and quantitative, it's been very high. So we review something in the order of 200 to 300 business plans a year. And I say last year, I think we funded 4 of them. So, you know, we don't have to go out and look very hard. We've got enough of them coming to us.
But when you were at Miami in an academic setting, were you thinking of doing business plans?
No. No.
I wasn't here.
No surprise. But you said you looked at 200 or 300 business plans a year and maybe funded 4. Is that because people don't know how to prepare a business plan that will satisfy venture capital requirements, expectations? They come from the bench?
Certainly there's a large number of those. But I would say of that, let's say the number was 200, I mean, I think 50 or 60 of them required a pretty good analysis because they struck some chord with us. Obviously, if you look at my partner Greg, who's out here someplace in the, Greg has certain things that he likes, I have certain things that I like, and my partner Nikon has certain things they like. So when a business plan comes in that really fits into our comfort zone, things that we like, that's more likely to get a review. It's not like we just look at everything with the same kind of
Sure, it's got to ring your bell.
It's got to ring our bell, right.
Yeah. Is it possible to ask, what's upcoming, what do you see as the most important needs, significant needs for innovation over the course of the next 10 or 20 years? What problems do we have to solve for which there might not now be solutions?
There are solutions on the horizon, but the word that we hear over and over again is sustainability. And I think sustainability, that problem will be solved through plant science. Between plants and algae, I don't see another solution that will provide the amount of energy that's going to be required, that's going to feed the world, that's going to use water more efficiently. Agriculture uses about 70% of all the water that's consumed in the United States, and I think actually around the world. It's far more than you and I consume. Agriculture is the major consumer. And anybody who has looked at the history of the Colorado River can appreciate that what is a very significant river can be entirely consumed through agriculture. So water is an enormous problem. But the use of nitrogen, the use of phosphate. So nitrogen fertilizers are synthesized. There's fertilizer industry. It's a very high energy process. So when we think about saving energy, if we can not use much fertilizer, or much nitrogen, that in itself saves energy.
Does that mean you have to develop a plant that will be more efficient in using nitrogen so you will have to apply less?
Yes, I think that's what
and
it means.
that'll help the Gulf of Mexico too.
Yes. And phosphate, by the way, is mined. So just as we think about petroleum being a limiting resource, phosphate's a limiting resource. And so these are all things that we've had the luxury for, well, all of human history of not worrying too much about. But I would say these things are now on the horizon, and we absolutely have to worry about them. And I don't see, unless we're going to stop eating, I don't see a solution other than through agriculture. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, we stop eating. So these are very large problems. They're, I think, also very large opportunities in plant science. I think you can go into the medical sciences and cure a disease, or you can go into plant sciences and save the world. It's sort of one of those two things. I vote for plant science.
If we eat well and nutritionally, we'll be healthier in any event.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think it's production is going to be the major. I mean, how we produce food, how we replace petroleum, are all blazingly clear problems that need to be solved. Mm-hmm. And we're not talking 100 years from now. We're talking about a much shorter period of time in which these problems need to be solved. And so they're very serious problems.
So Jen, I mentioned to you on our phone call that I was at the USDA reviewing grants not too long ago. And when you look at what people are applying grants for, which is kind of a window of, not real long-term, but reasonably medium-term, I guess you'd say. And I would say that a third of those grants were about traits, about producing better plants, some kind of, probably a greater than a third was, it had to do with biomass, so the ability to use biofuels. And then there's just kind of a mixture of other things, but water was a big part of that, how to some element of conserving water. So it gives you a little sense of what people are thinking about.
So when one thinks about drought-resistant plants, one can say, well, we want a drought-resistant plant because during the summer when there's less rain, we want the plant to grow well. But actually, the importance of a drought-resistant plant is you use less water. You irrigate less if you have a drought-resistant plant. So these are not just protections against the weather. These are really important in terms of the future of agriculture.
I'm thinking of the Colorado River, which came up just a few minutes ago, from a torrent to a trickle. And that trickle almost disappears, and if we keep using water, it won't be a trickle.
Right.
Now, I've been reading generally about agriculture lately, and I read about the amount of spoilage and waste. Bad distribution, bad storage facilities, so that a lot of food goes to waste. And I'm thinking, while it's terribly important to work on productivity, 2 or 3 billion more people in a few years, at some point you won't be able to continue to increase productivity, but if we could save and utilize more, that's as good as growing more. I don't know whether that's a plant science problem or an economics problem, but it occurred to me that storage, distribution, getting food to people is at least as important as simply growing and growing more. Does that make any sense? It's agricultural innovation. It might not be plant science innovation.
Logistics.
Yeah. I don't know where to weigh in on that. I think one of the things that's really clear is that in virtually all over the world, and this is especially true in developing countries, people are fleeing to the cities. And so the ability to produce food for the cities is I think, especially in developing countries, reaching a crisis level. And so having a better plant that is grown by fewer people, especially in developing countries, is almost certainly going to be necessary. And so something that we were excited about that came out of the current cassava project was one of these serendipitous findings, and that is that cassava, as many of you know, is a very, it degrades very quickly. Once you've harvested it, you've got about 48 hours and it starts to turn to mush. And so you have to process it quickly. And what that means is you can't put it on a shelf and sell it at a grocery store in Nigeria, for example. So one of the things that happened when they were genetically engineering the cassava is it turned out they were increasing vitamin A and decreasing the amount of cyanogens. And as a result of that, the cassava actually doesn't degrade so much. And that may be one of the most important things to come out of this project, because now this crop can actually be a crop. It can actually go and have some shelf life so that they can sell it. And that allows the farmer to make some money. It allows people in cities to have better food. And those are the kinds of innovations that I think are going to be very important. But it's I think, difficult for plant scientists to anticipate how to do that.
I guess in our world, it shows up in trying to use waste as a source of energy. So you hear about, the silage from plants or from, things like oils, waste oils and grease and things like that. We'll see a business plan along those lines every once in a while, but this problem of distribution it's just...
It's a problem. Let me shift from my questions to some questions from the audience. Overregulation has slowed the introduction of beneficial plant traits. Do you see changes in future regulations, better or worse? I wish there were an example there of regulation slowing the introduction of beneficial plant traits. One of you all may have an example. But what's the future of regulation as it encourages or maybe slows innovation?
This is the gating issue for venture capital being involved in the plant science world. We can see all these great traits, but there's two big problems with a better plant or better seed. One is regulatory, what kind of hoops. Different parts of the world, you've got different regulations, so it's a very complicated issue. And the second problem is there's only 5 buyers at the end of the day for a lot of the big crops, and so that always, when we invest in a company, what we'd love to do, it doesn't happen very often, but we'd love to set up an auction of some sort to sell the company to. But if you only got, Monsanto, Syngenta, Dow, DuPont, Pioneer, it's hard to set up an auction. So that's one of the big issues. The regulation is a huge issue, and it keeps changing on us. In fact, I would say every regulatory agency that's in the regulatory U.S. regulatory system is frustrating as heck because of how often they change things. Of course, the FDA is notorious for how often they change things. I think the U.S. Well, of course, a lot of things have to go. Some of the plant world has to go through the FDA, and some has to go through the USDA, and they're both pretty frustrating.
Yeah. And there are things changing now that there's things coming down the line. We don't know the future of them. So, for example, it's unclear how algae, if you do genetic engineering of algae, how that's going to be regulated. I mean, there simply aren't rules out there. We don't even know which agency is going to be controlling that. So it's really very complicated right now. But I don't see it going away. There's nothing on the horizon that says let's pull back here. But it'll be interesting when we start to genetically engineer plants and algae that are clearly not food. So the regulation has to do with the fact of the matter is what comes out of almost all fields are things we eat or our animals eat. And that's going to change. But it's unclear, in fact, it's very unclear what the regulatory landscape is going to be in those circumstances. And that, I imagine, complicates Brian's life to no end.
Well, this next question kind of relates to that, I think. It's to you, Brian. St. Louis has a reputation of being a show-me state. Are we too conservative for our own good? Does not having crazy money really limit our ability to build a plant science version of Silicon Valley here in the Midwest? Crazy money?
No. Which money is crazy?
I've heard of monopoly money.
I'll take the high road on this. And so if you would ask, in fact, was asked this question a lot in the last 10 years or so, and my answer would have been, yeah. The answer is probably yes. We are a little too conservative here. But I think it's turning around to an amazing extent in the last, 4 or 5 years. There's a number of programs that, you remember when I talked about that chasm between getting something that's right off the bench top and then it has to get to a proof of concept. There is suddenly now, there's funds at Washington University, there's funds at the University of Missouri, there's a Helix fund here in town. There's the marvelous biogenerator at Washington, or associated with Washington University in SLU, that's providing some of that money that's getting through that chasm. So St. Louis is, and the other, just not probably as interesting to this crowd, but all of a sudden the IT world is starting to bubble up in St. Louis again. So I think actually all these, a ship is raised by all the water, and I think this entrepreneurial spirit is beginning to boil up again in St. Louis, far better than I've seen it in the last 20 years. So I'm actually pretty bullish right now on what's going on in St. Louis. One of the problems is there's not enough venture capital, quite frankly. Checks will be collected at the door. And it's an interesting continuum, we have to have the great technology that's developed, because that's at least, you have a shot at getting it here in St. Louis. You've got to have that next set of money, you've got to have venture capital money, and you've got to have money that maybe is kind of a long-term, sustainable kinds of money. You need to have all of that, or, you know, we're going to have companies start and leave town, which is not to anybody's liking.
This one is exactly for you. Can you name 3 things you look for in a proposal for funding that comes to you?
Yeah, you know, it's kind of back to that question of how many ways can a company fail, and it's
Let me count the ways.
it's a lot. So it's sometimes difficult to pick the 3 most important. But I'll tell you how what the answer usually is. It always starts with the management, the paradigm that, or the old saw that great leaders will take bad technology and make it work, but bad leaders will even screw up a good technology. So it always starts with management. We spend a lot of time thinking and worrying about what the leadership of our companies are. And since we're an early stage company, a lot of times what we get is a technologist to come to us. And much like what we talked about with Derek and Jim McCarter, we like to, at the very beginning, match up the technologist with the good business person that can carry these companies forward. So management's number 1. Probably markets is number 2. You like to be able to you know, do a calculation of what this company is worth, and that's you kind of start with what do you think somebody will buy the company with. So I would say management, markets, and then in our world there's this whole issue of how do you protect it, the intellectual property, what kind of patents do you have, those sorts of things. In life science, it's extraordinarily important. But then there's regulatory issues, there's third-party payer issues, there's, you know, all kinds of other things too.
Long checklist.
Long checklist. My slide on this has 12 things.
So asking for the top 3, and then, you know. This one may be for you, Jan. Here we are in landlocked Midwest. What can you say about the future use of algae and microalgae as production facilities for better proteins and enzymes? And then a sort of a footnote, what major projects are going on here right now?
That's a really good question, because we have 2 large projects that are funded by the Department of Energy. And one of them is a total of $70 million over 3 years. We're part of a rather large consortium. But it is, I've really enjoyed it because it's given me a lot of insight into the world of algae that I didn't have 2 years ago. And the biggest insight is it's really complicated. And so the answer to that question I don't think is really available yet. I would say the conventional wisdom 2 or 3 years ago was the Southwest would be a really good place to grow algae because it's so bright and it's got clear skies, and that's going to be a wonderful place for photosynthetic organisms. In fact, many of the initial trials were done there. Well, it turns out it's probably not going to be the Southwest, and it's not going to be the Southwest because there's a lot of things that can go wrong with growing algae, and one of them is you can get too much sunlight. And so the Southwest actually does have almost too much sunlight. We'll have to engineer the algae to grow under such severe conditions. And by the way, algae grows in water, and it's a desert down there.
Yeah,
so
I was going to mention that. Right. We started this program talking
Right.
about water, and
Yeah.
water comes up when you talk about algae.
Yes. So, you know, I think these things are not at all decided right now, and they're not clear. But the southeast of the United States, places like Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, are actually probably well positioned. We get a significant amount of rain. There's large areas of this part of the country that are not really heavily farmed, that could probably deal with an algae farm. Maybe going down towards Georgia and those areas, the temperatures are right. You could grow most of the year, but not all of the year. If you get to Florida, you could probably grow most of the year. But we don't even know for sure what kind of algae are going to be the most productive. And this is in really broad terms. So there are generally 2 types of algae that people think about. And some grow in salt water and some grow in fresh water. And it seems like that should be obvious as to which is the better for producing large amounts of oil. But in fact, it's not obvious. There are strong arguments for either one. And part of the $70 million grant is to try to resolve some of those questions. And then I was talking with one of the guests in the audience earlier today, Jim Johnson, and pointing out that once you have figured out what's the best strain, whether it should be saltwater or freshwater, and where's the best way to grow it, you still have to figure out how to harvest it. And so there's an enormous engineering problem that's associated with it. And one need only go down to Anheuser-Busch and look at what's involved with making beer, and you can say, all right, it's that kind of engineering problem. That's not a biology problem. That is strictly an engineering problem. And they have a far bigger, with algae, it's a far bigger problem because the algae are relatively dilute. So you've got a lot of water and a little bit of biomass, and that's actually what you want is that little bit of biomass. And so there's some real technological hurdles that really have to be overcome that have nothing to do with regional aspects. But to come back to the original question, is this part of the country potentially attractive for growing algae? And I would say it's as good as any. And there's clearly some places where it's not good. So almost everything north of here, it's too cold too much of the year. Going south,
That's true, has been true, but given
but we have a head start.
I'm thinking you could do it at least in Iowa now, maybe Minnesota.
Well, you know, the winters are well, this winter you might have been able to do it a little bit. Remember that if you have to heat something up, then you're putting energy in. The whole idea is to get energy out. So it's, there are definitely a large number of limitations, and there are very complex issues that still are, I won't say unresolved. People are thinking very hard about them, but the solutions are not there yet.
I've been signaled that we have one more question time for. So this is a very general question, but it may be a good one to end on. Give us an estimate of the time from discovery to patent and general use. And my answer to that would be it varies. But you can probably add more detail than I can.
Well, in fact, this would probably be a good shared question. I can tell you to get from the bench to a patent is highly variable, but it rarely happens overnight or in a month. It's usually good patents, good technologies are not, oh my God, discoveries, but rather a lot of hard work. And so it's frequently years to go from an idea, you know, actually from basic research to a patent. After that, what happens?
You know, we've been focusing on the hard ones, the ones that take lots of money and lots of time. But it's actually back to when you opened up and talked about, well, there's biotechnology or ag technology, and there's also ag. Mm-hmm. You know, some of the niftiest technologies that we've seen, I think about this, we have something called the Ag Showcase here every year where we have corporations that are in the ag world, and we have entrepreneurs coming, they interact with each other. And I remember one that I thought was really kind of clever. It was just basically a roller that made the right kind of hole in the ground to trap water. And they had a patent, and you know, how long do you think it took them to commercialize it? It didn't take hardly any time at all, right. You know? I mean, that's kind of the neat thing about ag. There's also some very practical, straightforward kinds of questions. Mm-hmm. So what I'm saying is you're right. If you take I don't know, somebody in the audience can tell me better, you know, how long did it take Roundup to, you know, go from this to what it is today? And it was a long, long time. You know, from the patent point of view, you've got 20 years from the point that you submit your patent. So there is kind of an end point that you have to kind of recognize. But, you know, I suppose it's not unusual for technologies to take 10, 15, 20 years to get to wide scale practical use.
That seems reasonable.
Let me argue. I'll take moderator's license here, and I want to give you an example I read about in the paper the other day and see if there are any agricultural examples. Reading about the development of Post-it notes by 3M. Mm-hmm. The article that I read reported that scientists at 3M found a very weak glue. It was so weak it could barely hold anything together, and what would this be good for? And then another scientist at 3M singing in the choir had bookmarks falling out. It occurred to me, boy, if they would just stay in place. And that was a Post-it note. You could tear it off and not leave any trace. They had a solution in search of a problem, and an unrelated scientist had the problem and knew the solution instantly. Are there any examples of that in agriculture where there's a solution waiting for a problem that someone else identifies and recognizes they've got a solution on the shelf?
None come to my mind, but I would bet in places like Monsanto and Dow Agro, that happens much more often than it would in a context of this, because there are so many people that have a better context of that. I'm probably going to leave here and think of 10 examples of where this is true, but none comes to my mind right now. It's a great question.
I can't think of a real good example either, although just touching on relevance is the fact that we're all used to eating chicken that looks the way it looks. It has kind of a yellow, and the history behind that, that Haldane used to tell me all the time, is the fact that some chickens ate some marigolds, and suddenly they noticed the meat looked not that pasty white kind of thing. Light bulb went off, and then that's why our chickens look the way they do now, is because you can feed a chicken something like something that has a lot of color in it, and it influences the meat.
Yeah.
I can tell chicken stories all the time because
On that colorful note, I think it's time to call the evening to a close. Thank you all for questions. Thank you for being here, and thank
Thank you.
my panelists. And now a few words from our leader.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. And I want to thank all of our panelists. First with Jim. Jim, you do a great job. Jim and I joke at every one of these. I say there's only one thing I ask: make it interesting. And you did that. Thank you very much. Brian, Jan, thank you very much for joining us here. I just have a few thoughts. This last word thing is really nice. I like having the last word because I can kind of formulate what I'm going to talk about for an hour. And there were two things that came to mind about innovation and plant science in agriculture. One, I'm going to tell you, serendipity plays a big part in innovation, and recognizing the value of a serendipitous thing is huge. The other is just how rare what we want to happen really does happen. So the serendipity, does anybody here know what perhaps the most important discovery in getting cereal grains grown reproducibly across a wide range of environments over the past 50 years has been? It's a serendipitous discovery. It's a mutant that made grains grow short, rice, wheat. Intuitively, you would think a taller grain, more biomass, bigger seed heads. No. The key genetic mutation, one of the key genetic mutations that enabled the Green Revolution, was a mutation that led to shorter growing plants. And the reason that's so important is because short plants don't blow over so easily. When it rains, they get wet, and then the wind blows. This was huge. Recognizing the value of a short mutant plant was incredible. The other example I want to give is this idea, why don't we just produce better types of plants, better bioenergy crops? Switchgrass. Switchgrass was mentioned in a presidential State of the Union address many years ago. So the next day everyone was talking switchgrass, switchgrass. Well, why don't we just develop switchgrass as a crop? It's not a domesticated crop yet. But here's the quiz, and this is the fun fact that you can take away. Who knows what the last domesticated crop was? The last crop that started off as a wild plant and that scientists and breeders took, bred, improved, and then put on the market that succeeded? What was the last crop we domesticated as humans? Shout it out if you know. Haven't heard it yet. All great guesses. All great guesses. Kiwi. Kiwi was the last crop humans domesticated. That happened a long time ago. Domestication and producing fundamentally different types of crops is really, really difficult, and Jan and Brian touched on some of this tonight. If a market doesn't exist, what's the pull to develop the new variety if you can't sell it? If tractors don't exist to harvest, how are you going to convince a farmer to go from soybeans to miscanthus? How are you going to convince someone who doesn't have a way to process the oil out of camelina, which Jan is going to run into here? How do you, without an infrastructure and a market and technology to deal with a product, let alone, where do you ship it to? These are all huge problems. And so, Brian, you're going to have to figure out how to get the commercial sector to solve these problems. What society is going to have to do to integrate new types of crops is a big problem we're all going to have to deal with. So with that, I'm going to end. Thank you all for coming. I want to mention specifically a few individuals. Matt Wolf, thank you very much. The new chair of the Friends Committee, thank you very much. Robin Frankel, I know you're here somewhere. I know I thanked you last time, but thank you again for your service the past year. Molly Klein is the new chair of Conversations. Thank you, Molly, for taking this on. We look forward to a number of interesting conversations over the coming year. So again, thank you all for coming. Have a safe trip home.